We are in week 12E out of our 17 plus 1 week semester here in our the Roots of Hip Hop Dance class. And when I originally wrote this curriculum, I started out, we are in week focusing on not hip hop, but jazz dance, because that is where more of my background comes from in terms of the dances that I've trained in and performed over my life. And as I did the research for this class and started writing up your course materials, what I realized is that I was really writing a class more broadly about Black vernacular dance and how it evolved in America and to some extent in Europe. And I kept just noticing the way that jazz dance and hip hop dance's stories are just absolutely intertwined all the way through the last 150 years. And so I'm mentioning this again because this next section, which is on eroticization, so the idea of that there's definitely like dance that's purposefully sexy, and that designation comes with a lot of social stigma. And so I am going to talk in this section, this category, there's I think 3 weeks, we have this week, next week, and the following week, all about issues of feminism, which means that we definitely need to talk about intersectionality and how using sexuality in dance, just like using skill and exoticness, as we spoke about in our earlier category, which was referring to not only being of a we can't even say majority race or ethnic background, but just being different from the group of people who are in power and had the most money, was both shunned and also often the only viable option to get some power and equity back. And that is also true with being a woman. And it's especially true when those things intersect. And that means for women who are both non-white women, so women of color and women who may not be straight. And so we're going to separate from, we're just going to focus mostly on like feminist history today, and then reach that out into intersectionality as we go, because as much as I am definitely obviously a feminist, there are ways in which white feminism has really left behind other groups. And so we're going to talk about that. And next week, we're going to focus on the inimitable Bob Fosse. And there's a big article that I wrote in your next week's work talking about Bob Fosse and his influences of tap jazz and minstrelsy. And then the following week, the third week, we're going to talk about divas. So today is going to be mostly history. Just a little heads up, there's kind of a lot of reading next week. So if you want to swish together these 3 weeks, it's a good time to like tackle if you have more study time one week or the other. And then the third week, we're going to talk about divas like Beyonce, who we started watching today, and also Josephine Baker, who is, I mean, the world just wouldn't be the world that we know and love without her effort, amazing work, both as a performing artist and an activist. So today, here we go. I'm going to bring us on over to my notes. So today we are going to cover a lot: feminism, the overview of the 4 waves, working women. Why is it that sexuality is taboo? Relating the function of selling the eroticized body versus the exoticized body, right? So talking about how things that are taboo in the upper, like the class that has the most power and money, then become things that those people with money want to see on stage. High class versus low class. So this is I think this is a really important thing to bear in mind in terms of examining our own sense of bias and how poverty works, how economics work in performing arts, and women's bodily autonomy. I don't know why that doesn't know how to spell that. So in America, we are currently, it's 2023, having probably dozens of legal fights about the legality of abortion. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how the idea of abortion became politicized, how it was made a moral issue by politicians who were flipping their stance on it, and also how the question of abortion is even more amplified and also less important than the issue of bodily autonomy when it comes to women who are also women who live in poverty or who are minority people of color, because for them in the last 100 years, it wasn't just about abortion, it was also about eugenics and forced sterilization. So grim stuff, but also really fun dance. So I started us out today with a few examples from my question of like, where are we at today with sexuality and performance? And what does it mean to be an empowered and sexy dancer, right? Because the flip side of that is the term slut shaming. And slut shaming is when we as a country put down a woman who is behaving in a way that we see to be sexual and call it cheap or call it sold out, or disbelieve that that woman is acting of her own choice, that maybe she's doing it just for money or just for attention. There's lots of ways that we do slut shaming in this country. So putting some awareness into those ideas about how we see sexuality and how we react to it, because I think that's one of the places where all of us, including those of us who are feminists, and we're going to talk about this in the 4 waves, maybe put judgment on certain types of dance and performance based on these subconscious biases. Okay, how are we doing so far? Just going to pause because there's a lot today. And this is definitely like my soapbox. As I said, this was the original idea I had for the class. So I get really excited about all of these topics, and I just want to pause. How are you? Good morning. Anybody out there? Any questions so far? And I'm going to put in our little vocabulary words that I've so far into the chat. Can you guys just check in with me pretty please? Good morning, Natasha. Okay, vocab words. Intersectionality, feminism, slut shaming. This looks so unfun when I type it all out together. Empowerment and bodily autonomy. Phew, that's a big list. Good morning, Adriel. All right. So have you guys seen that old school Destiny's Child with Beyonce in it before? Have you seen that video? I just love it. And it's like the costumes are out of this world. But even more so, I love that pink Moulin Rouge video. That's just totally my jam. Okay, you ready? Let me find the right page to screen share for you. Maybe it got closed. Okay. Let's reopen this. Okay, so this link, Grady's article on the 4 waves of feminism, is part of your reading this week. So we talk about 4 waves of feminism, and we are currently in the 4th wave. And as with all things historical, there's a bit of blurry line between when the 3rd wave ended and the 4th wave began. But I need you to know for your final essay writings the difference between each 4 of them. So I've tried to like This is a great article that explains how to break them down in your mind. These are mostly more current into us. So here we go. The first wave of feminism. Can we get this bigger? Yeah, we can. Okay, first wave of feminism is, roughly speaking, from 1848 to 1920. So that doesn't mean that there weren't feminists before then. There certainly were. One of the most well-known feminists before that area is actually the mother of the woman who wrote the book Frankenstein. So I don't know if you ever thought about Frankenstein as a feminist work, but it is fun ideas to dive into in your future literature classes. So Mary Shelley was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who in the 1700s was a well-known writer who was rejecting marriage per se, although she did live in a household with a partner and have children and was like a working mother in the 1700s. And she also like left the country. This is before she had children. She left the country and moved to France to participate in the French Revolution. So just to say, badass women who are not going to be restricted by social mores, and who are still hardworking, intelligent, and good to their children, have existed for hundreds of years, which I'm sure you know. But we think about the first wave of feminism happening in 1848 because that is when the first like convention of women about the right to vote. So the first like political organized group of women working together met, and that's the Seneca Falls Convention. So at the Seneca Falls Convention, they talked about the writings by Mary Wollstonecraft, and rejected a lot of ideas. We think about Seneca Falls Convention as being women trying to get the right to vote. But I think in some ways that is really sort of a whitewashing of it, and sort of like it's a historical perspective, because the suffragettes, as they were known in the early 1900s, that was one of their greatest achievements, is they had achieved the right to vote for women in England, in America, and all over the world at different times. By the way, late to the game over here in America, right? But maybe you remember Mary Poppins and the mom of the children who was considered a suffragette. And even though I'm not saying anything bad about Mary Poppins, but I am, they didn't really present her as being a very, like the personification of the children's mother in Mary Poppins, who was a suffragette, was not 100% flattering. And that's because there's just a little bit of still, I'm not sure about those uppity women going on, right, when Mary Poppins was made. Okay, so first wave feminism, if you're going to simplify it, you want to think about it as the middle of the 1800s to the Jazz Age. And their biggest accomplishment was the right to vote for women, which means legally we are supposed to be equal with men. We all know that that fight is not over yet, but we have the right to vote in America in 1920. And what they really started talking about was in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, that there are really upsetting issues about the way that women, especially women of color, were treated legally across the Western world. For example, women at that time could not divorce their husbands. You maybe could be allowed to divorce your husband if the whole community knew that he was beating you, maybe. But legally, a husband in 1848 was allowed to beat and rape his wife legally because she was essentially his property. Options vary a little bit by location, but for the large majority of the Western world in the 1800s, property owned by women often was really owned by the man at the point of marriage. And during this time, if you had a woman who, if you had a wife who you didn't approve of her behavior, you could, in the Victorian era, so this is the beginning of the Victoria era here, 1848, many times women who spoke out of term and who refused to fall into their position of servitude to their husbands would be called hysterical, quote unquote, and hysteria meant that you could be put in asylum. So if you were an uppity, outspoken woman and your husband wanted to keep your property, they could put you in asylum for the rest of your life and just do what they wanted with your land. So big issues here, right? The other thing that is important to know about the Seneca Balls Convention is that Sojourner Truth spoke there. So this was one of those, remember 1848 is before the Civil War. So these are examples of intersectional female speakers who came to speak at this convention. And at the time, the first wave feminists were thoroughly integrated with the abolitionist movements. And that was 1848. So this definitely leads into the Civil War. And most of the energy from first wave feminism at this time starts to shift into the abolitionist movement because of speeches by Sojourner Truth and other activists in the abolitionist movement, right? So universal suffrage was also on the table at that moment. And remember, suffrage means the right to vote, which is such a weird word, isn't it, for the right to vote? But later in the first movement, Susan B. Anthony, who sewed our American flag, right, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is also a feminist leader, they failed to continue to support women of color as things went on. And sort of the reason for that fallout at this time had a lot to do with getting what power you could to achieve what wins you could, and maybe also some like resentful racism. So the 15th Amendment passes in 1870, right? So we have a civil war and Black men are allowed to vote. And all of these women who were part of the feminist movement and Seneca Balls, who are part of the abolitionist movement, they didn't get the right to vote. And there was a fallout where these women then decided to be like break away from the women of color who had been working together with them before the Civil War. And that is honestly, it's shame, like both of these things are shameful, right? It's shameful that the women didn't get the right vote. And it's shameful that some of the most powerful voices in the first wave of feminism did not continue to support people of color after that, because basically, they had the choice to collect and gain. Suffragettes had to gain political power and clout with politicians in order to get the vote passed to amend the Constitution so they could get the right to vote. And after the Civil War, what do we have? We have that great period of time, Reconstruction, and then shortly after that, we have that terrible feeling of time, the Jim Crow era. And that Jim Crow era is when the women finally got the right to vote. And so there's that conundrum, right? That complication that the white women, in order to get the right to vote, which did apply to Black women as well, but in order for the suffragettes to get enough votes to change the Constitution, they had to focus on their whiteness, right? They had to sell that like educated white women should certainly have the right to vote. And that means like a little bit on to the side. I mean, if formerly enslaved Black men can vote, then why aren't white women? Like that conundrum came up and it was not ethical. But there's history for you, right? Complicated. All right, so suffragettes. First wave. Any questions so far? Suffragettes, sort of Victorian to Jazz age, right to vote. Yeah? Okay. Wave number 2. Oh, man. Got a big old ad there. That's unfortunate. Let me scroll that down a little bit. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the second wave is what we think about when you think about the 1960s to the 1980s, when you think about hippies burning their bras in America. And that begins all with a book called The Feminine Mystique. So in 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, and it was shared in basically women's book clubs all across the Western world. And it was also based on Simone de Beauvoir's work. And she was a French woman who wrote a book called The Second Sex in 1949, which came to the US in 53. And that book really talks about questioning gender norms and also lesbian love, and just really pushing back against all the things that people had believed were biological, hard science facts about the way that women act, the way that we are biologically endowed, and female potential. So in The Feminine Mystique, the American version of that doesn't talk so much about lesbianism, but it talks about this belief system which taught women that that a woman's most prime achievement would be motherhood and being a housewife. And so it was considered shameful, and to many extents in many cultures it still is considered shameful if a woman is not happy doing those jobs. And now, being in the fourth wave, we're starting to think that, here we are in the Bay Area, California. I think most people believe that women can do any job, probably, and then a woman. I think where we run into the bump against these old beliefs is the way that people believe that a woman who doesn't want to be a mother, or who doesn't feel maternal, is not reaching her full potential, or maybe something's a little off about her. So in the second wave, Western society is also starting to talk about sexuality. So the other reason why the second wave happens in the 1960s is because in 1959, the birth control pill, which had been created to prevent cancer, is legally allowed to be prescribed to women. And at first, it's prescribed for cancer prevention. Then there's stages where it's only prescribed to married women. And the same is true of birth control earlier in time. So one of the reasons why we know Elizabeth Cady Stanton's name is because she's the forerunner of Planned Parenthood. So in the 1800s, early 1900s, remember, there are very few options for pregnancy prevention in the United States. And the religious community has you believe that people don't have sex, and this is a lie, obviously, because we are all here. So when the late 1800s, early 1900s start, some of the things that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did was to start the first clinic where women could go to obtain, not birth control pill at the time, but diaphragms and family planning education. Because otherwise, you essentially, as a female, especially a woman who is married, and remember, almost all women are married by the age of 18, because that's how the society is set up for your house to be cleaned and for food to be happening at home, is that there is a woman who it's her job to feed and clean your house. And so that means that every woman who is sexually active is essentially pregnant almost every year, if you can imagine that, because I don't think that in the Bay Area, most families do not function that way anymore. But in the 1800s and 1900s, you certainly had more, your children weren't necessarily going to live, as many of them. In the 17 and 1800s, certainly a lot more kids died before age 5. But it was quite common for women to just have another child every year and a half, which of course would limit your potential to be able to study or have a career or do anything else. So when we start in the 1900s to be able to choose how many children we have, how many children we can afford to feed, how many times our bodies go through this process, and to not, thank you, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, have to ask our husbands who owned us permission to make those choices for ourselves. Then by the time we get to the 1960s, sorry, women are starting to ask, like, what can I do now that I have these choices? So 1960s, summer of love. Actual reliable birth control permits women who have previously had very few choices outside of motherhood and housewife. And remember, you're allowed to be a teacher or a nurse, but before the 1900s, before the world wars, even those jobs, women would be routinely fired upon becoming engaged or getting pregnant. So if you've ever seen Mad Men in the 1960s, they talk about how some of the women there's lots of women working in the office, but they're all young women. And as soon as they become engaged or pregnant, they're pushed out of the workplace because you're supposed to be making room for the men. So that's sort of this element that's going on in the 1960s, right? So the access to birth control allows women to start to talk about their ability to work and their desire to work, and what are the institutional oppressions that are keeping them from having real careers and equal play. So you can see in this photo, this is like one of those women's book clubs where they're talking about their potential together and reading books. I guess this is Yoko Ono in here, fun fact. So the big two issues for the second wave of feminism are going to be working and abortion, right? Because in the 1960s, the birth control pill is legalized, but that doesn't mean it's accepted across the country, and there's not sex education. So these women wanted women to be in charge of their own bodies, to have a healthy sexual relationship so that they weren't being taken advantage of, and to be able to make choices about planning their own parenthood. And that includes abortion. And the big achievement of the second wave of feminism is Roe v. Wade, which was overturned this last year. And the way that the second wave failed us, our nation, is because we, again, we meaning white women, failed to support issues that were more important to women who lived intersectionally. And that is that many of the more empowered or more privileged members of this movement continued to focus on the right to work outside of the home. But for Black women and women of color in this country, they have been working and being mothers all the damn time from the start, right? So that was like not the issue for them. For women of color, the issue was that our country in the middle of this century and even all the way into the 2000s was sterilizing women of color and poor women in this country. And by that, I mean often dishonestly sterilizing them. So forced sterilization continued to happen in the state of California, even in the last decade in prisons. An example being, there was a woman who had children already. She was in prison. She knew that she had some sort of cancer or fibroids. And so she went to have surgery, and the doctors decided that she didn't need her reproductive organs. And so they just took them all out while she was under without her permission when she had wanted to have more kids. That is definitely a thing that happened. It happened on the East Coast in Virginia when there were like basically group homes. Sometimes they would decide that women, in order to be able to move out of the group home in their late teens, that they needed to be forced sterilized. Like basically you're telling a teenager, if you want to get out of this group care, you need to submit to being forced sterilized. And that is about eugenics. So let me pause and check in here with y'all, because whoa, we're getting places. Natasha's asking, what was overturned this year? Roe v. Wade is the Supreme Court, what's the right word? There was a Supreme Court case in the 1970s that legalized abortion in America on the basis of the argument that a woman's bodily autonomy, so being able to have control over your own physical body, is a valid reason to make a medical decision. So that was overturned because of the two Supreme Court justices who President Trump pushed in, who swore to do that. So now it's being decided state by state whether women are allowed to choose an abortion. And in California, there's been a big commitment to keep that freedom in place. California believes that abortion is part of healthcare. Accidental pregnancies happen. Birth care control does fail. And many other states in this country are removing the access to abortion or making it only accessible after a certain number of weeks of pregnancy. And in many states that are conservative states with a lot of conservative or politics that are largely funded by religious groups, especially evangelical Christians who believe that abortion is murder, they have made it so that abortion is technically legal, but only at week 7. But most women don't know that they are pregnant by week 7, especially if you have been using birth control. And so you think you shouldn't be pregnant and it's an accident. And then there's many, many other problems, because sometimes women need access to abortions because of problems in their pregnancy. So you can have an ectopic pregnancy, which can kill you. But right now, in any of those states that don't have access to abortion, none of the doctors have the equipment or skills to be able to save your life when there's like a problem down there, because they will be legally sued in Texas or lose their license in many of half the states of this country now in the past year. So there's people, like, women will die. That's what it always comes down to. And since we're talking about eugenics and the South and those states that it's not just the South, and conservative states that are removing those laws as we speak. In fact, just this week, a lot of those laws were allowing the abortion pill to stay on the market. The abortion pill also, you have to be under 8 weeks. So you probably, like many women, don't know, or you just found out, you have to make that decision to take the pill. The pill's pretty safe. And but conservative states with the new conservative judges that Trump appointed are now, this last week, have sorry, I don't have this part of the lecture ingrained in stone, so it just happened. They're saying that the pill was pushed through by the FDA too quickly, and so they're trying to take the pill off the market in order to restrict that form of abortion care access as well. There's also a opposite side court case that happened last week, and I think it was either Oregon or Washington, where the opposite was decided by the judge. So there's just more court cases coming up to determine our right to healthcare access. Yes, and thank you for asking, because I was just trying not to go off on a tangent too much, but it's really important information and I'm happy to share. Okay, so we were talking about eugenics and forced sterilization. And so I have been trying to gather some additional links for you guys. Hold on, I forgot to press screen share. Just a moment. One of the favorite short versions that I found is actually this NPR player. It's a podcast. I'm just going to play part of it.
This week, it'll mark 50 years since the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision that made abortion a constitutionally protected right, at least 49 years. In U.S. history, though, abortion wasn't always controversial. In fact, in colonial America, it was considered a fairly common practice, a private decision made by women and aided mostly by midwives. But in the mid-1800s, a small group of physicians set out to change that. Led by a zealous young doctor named Horatio Storer, they launched a campaign to make abortion illegal in every state. Here are hosts Ramtin Arablouei and Rund Abdel Fattah from our history podcast, Throughline.
In 1860, governors of every single state in the U.S. received this letter from the recently established American Medical Association.
The evil to society of this crime is evident from the fact that its instances in this country are now to be counted by hundreds of thousands.
But there was really only one guy holding the pen.
Horatio Storer.
Carissa Haugeberg is an associate professor of history at Tulane University. She studied the formation of the anti-abortion movement.
Basically, he ghost wrote a letter from the president of the AMA. So it looked like it was coming from the president, but Storer was actually the one who wrote it, saying that the AMA opposes abortion. And he used the language of morality.
The letter was pivotal to what historians call the physicians' crusade against abortion. And Storer was making a few key arguments for why abortion should be illegal across the country. First, he introduced a new idea.
The child is alive from the moment of conception.
That life began at conception. Up till now, people generally agreed that life began when a woman could actually feel life move inside her, known then as quickening. But that wasn't enough for Storer. He campaigned on a moral argument that also tapped into the racial fears of the moment. Fears that would eventually inspire a pseudo-scientific field of, quote, racial improvement and planned breeding of the population, American eugenics. These racial fears would inspire forced sterilization programs to decrease certain populations, whereas Storer's anti-abortion campaign was trying to increase other populations by focusing on
the birth rate for Protestant white women had been declining over the course of the 19th century. So he had fears of what was commonly referred to as race suicide, that the Anglo stock wasn't going to replenish itself fast enough to keep up with the swells of new immigrants to the United States.
And who is going to have power and populate this country and populate the Great Plains and the Great West?
Leslie Regan is a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.
Well, it is going to be Chinese migrants, is going to be African Americans, newly freed people, and Catholics. They're not the ones using abortion. It's our, Yankee women who are using abortion, trying to get into medical school, trying to do politics when they should be at home having babies and taking care of them.
Michelle Goodwin is a professor at the University of California, Irvine, in the areas of law and bioethics.
They began to say we need white women to use their loins because they're concerned about the blackening and the browning of what at that point became the United States. And this real concern that when Black people become free, what will this mean for white people? And white women become a key to that.
So part of Storer's thinking was that criminalizing abortion would help rebalance the scales of who was being born into this country. But there was more to this strategy. He saw this as a way to finally knock out the competition, midwives.
So there's more great capitalist thread that they're about to talk to there. But you can kind of see, remember I was talking about, this is first wave feminism times. You can see that this conservative white nationalist push to make sure that there's quote unquote enough Anglo stock in America after the Black men are freed puts the white women of the first wave feminism into sort of this direct conflict with the previously enslaved Black people who have just been freed after the Civil War, right? Because if those women, the first wave feminists, want to get the right to vote, they need to get the white politicians to change the constitution. And if they are going to side with the previously enslaved people, then the white politicians are not going to be able to get enough votes with the Southern politicians who are supporting the Ku Klux Klan at that time to be able to pass the right to vote for women. That was a lot, you guys. We just connected like women's right to vote with eugenics, aka white racism in America, that, by the way, is where Hitler got the idea. Have I lost you? Are we kind of on board with that chunk of history? How are we doing out there? I'm just gonna shut it for a moment. Yeah. And that kind of makes sense. Like, how did we go from the Seneca Falls, like Sojourner Truth being a leader of the women's feminist movement to like, it's all white girl suffragettes by the 1920s. And now you kind of see like how it was, what were the forces that broke up that alliance? Shouldn't have happened, but that's the complication. So, okay, so that's how it was in first wave feminism. And remember, up until that point, abortion in the 1800s, when we might think it was like super, super old fashioned days, was a normal part of human existence and normal part of society that happened privately between a midwife and a woman, right? And there were midwives in every town. Women gave birth at home, largely because you would like someone with the same parts as you, like to be helping you along with that. And that knowledge of like how to deliver babies was often transferred, not through an institution as it now it is, yay. But at the time, midwives were apprenticed by other midwives. So the part of that podcast we were just listening to, it's got another 3 minutes that he's about to get into, is that initial dude, his name fresh in my mind again. What was his name? Storer? Oh goodness, come on. Horatio Storer. Turn my share screen back on. So Horatio Storer, who wrote that letter for the American Medical Association, right? The AMA is still a huge institution in this country. And so this guy basically used his clout to send this letter as though it were from the whole institution. The other thing that he had motivating him, aside from blatant racism, was also that he was a doctor and he didn't want midwives taking his business, right? And this definitely is an issue. You have women who are trying to apply to medical school because maybe they already were a midwife and they want to get like licensed, or because maybe they just want to improve their lot in life or become smarter, right? And so the male doctors at the time, which were all of them, were very resistant to the competition from these new female applicants to medical schools. And so by deciding to put a moral bend on this issue, that abortions are morally wrong, which was not believed at that time in many cultures around the world, if not all of them. It is not believed that life begins at the moment of conception, but that life begins at the moment of quickening, which they were saying. So that's when a woman feels movement within her body, and that is generally considered, or had been until the mid 1800s and beyond, still is true in many countries, when a life begins. So this changing of that date to conception was done for the moral purposes of this guy wanting to not let women be doctors because it would press in on his business. So press in on his business, and because of his belief in eugenics. So eugenics is the belief that it's just a belief in racial purity, right? That it's like that's as hard. It's like a pseudoscience version of white supremacy. And I'm trying to like get us back to our main entourage. We're trying to get back to the 1960s. So in the 1960s, this was still existing, and this idea of eugenics, but it is sort of smashed down and like has other names to it. And so mostly you would see forced sterilization happening in like halfway houses and in penal institutions. So women and men, especially of color, but also sometimes those who were uneducated or poor, who would end up in halfway houses, either because, you know, children who were in group homes, basically, who were orphaned, or women who were who went to jail, and you could go to jail for substance abuse, drunk in public. You could go to jail for being too poor to have a house and like loitering on the street, right? Those people often were mistreated or misled or given a false choice, like you can get out on parole earlier if you let us surgically cut out all of your reproductive organs. And this means not tying their tubes. This means removing uterus and ovaries, which means for the rest of their life, they're going to go through like huge hormonal issues, right? And men were like essentially castrated, men of color. So we think about that as seeming like so incredibly bizarre and like must have happened eons ago, but there are cases of this happening in California in the 2000s. And like, California, come on, guys, we think we are so great. We're not perfect. Goodness, no. Okay, so in the second wave, that is the split that happens between people of color and the more privileged women in the second wave feminism. White women in the second wave feminism are fighting for sexual freedom, abortion rights, and the right to work, like equal pay issues. Those are still important issues. But because when the second wave started up, it was more integrated, not addressing forced sterilization, that's like really a deal breaker, right? I mean, that's messed up. Thumbs down, second wave feminists. Let's go to the third wave. Okay. So the third wave is, I am just so you know, I am 42. I'm about to be 43. So my growing up, I think of like my teen years were in the 1990s. I think of myself as a third to fourth wave generation. I happen to be like right on the change year for generation. What is it, YZ? I don't even know anymore, you guys. So I have a lot of fond memories of like going to, for example, gay pride parades in the 1990s, where we're talking and doing sex education in my high school as a peer advisor, where we're teaching people to be able to speak so that you can consent or not consent to having sex with someone, and so that you can negotiate safer sex because of the AIDS epidemic. That is like where my youthful relationship to feminists started. So in the third wave, there's this very strong, like, reclaiming your sexuality motivation, right? In the second wave, remember, we're talking about hippies, to overgeneralize, and the idea of burning your bras. So these women who wanted to work in the second wave, they were really like, I'm not going to wear makeup anymore. I'm not going to dress up for you. I'm going to like do my thing, whatever that is, right? But by the time we get to the third wave, we have rights to abortion, where we have rights to get into college and to work, maybe not treated equally, obviously worse for women of color. Got to just say that over and over again so we don't forget it. But the third wave is like where people really start focusing on the idea of sexual freedom, right? So we start to see women being girls, right? So you have punk rockers wearing lipstick, right? Joan Jett. Yeah. They wanted sexuality to no longer be shamed. They wanted to acknowledge and bring it out into the open so that it couldn't be used against them. Okay, so the third wave, we're talking about people sort of say that like the second wave was like 60s to 80s ish, and these are all generalizations, right? The second wave definitely starts after the legalization of birth control pill. That's 1959 in America, and it goes around about to the 1980s. And in the 1980s, there was still like a really big pressure on this like capitalist white privilege ideal. So women were supposed to be pretty and prim, and the feminists were pushing back against that, but they didn't think that it meant that they needed to, they wanted to reclaim sexuality and beauty as part of feminist experience. It wasn't just for quote unquote good girls or conservative girls. And so there was like this powerful part, right? The political issues for the third wave, and you asked when it ended, and we're not really sure yet because we are just entering the fourth wave. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but hopefully I can cover this. So third wave is talking about sex workers' rights. So like, not only are we de-shaming sexuality itself, but then we're starting to examine, why do we shame sex workers? Like, aren't they human beings? Don't they deserve equity in the workplace? Employment equity, right? In the 1980s and 90s, we still have huge wage disparity gaps, still do, worse for people of color. The big things that I remember about this are sexual education in schools and access to low-cost family planning. And this last one got better with the third wave of feminists and is now being attacked. So what does that mean? So sex ed in schools became pretty standard well, I don't know, I didn't live in the South, but in California, you had things like the peer educator movement. So when I was 14, I would do a training with my peers, and then 2 or 3 of your fellow high school students would come during the sex ed period, which, you know, the science is taught by your science teacher, but then the like how to talk about sex and how to insist on having safe sex if you're going to have sex, how to put a condom on a banana, that stuff was being done by your fellow teenagers in high school. And that's part of the third wave movement. And access to low-cost family planning. So this is part of what makes Planned Parenthood such a huge deal in our country, is because so many, especially conservative states, restrict access to family planning and reproductive care services by restricting the laws that allow funding to pay for certain things, right? So, for example, there's some states in which the Medicare money, right, federal money that would come into the states to help to pay for, I'm sorry, that's Medicaid. Federal money that comes into the states to help to pay for basic health insurance for extremely, like, the lowest economic run, so people at the poverty line, right? So that someone who is at the poverty line who has to go to the emergency room so that the hospital gets paid, right? That's a human right. Kind of in this country, but not really. Planned Parenthood stepped in as like a separate nonprofit model to make sure that in those conservative states where that money, they would say like, oh, you can't access reproductive care or birth control with that money because we don't believe in it. And so that's how they would sort of cut out that sort of access. Planned Parenthood started opening and doing their own fundraising to be able to help women have access to healthcare and in places like that. And even in like more liberal states like California, just by opening a clinic that was nearby. Because if you're in a more rural area, there might not be a clinic for a 3 hours drive. And if you're 17 and you don't have a car, guess what? You're going to carry that baby to term, even if you were raped. That's what we mean by access to low-cost family planning. So that's third wave feminism. And I didn't say it here, but like also, let me just put that in, HIV, AIDS prevention was definitely a huge part about that, right? Okay, so fourth wave, maybe we're talking about fourth wave starting in the late 90s. Maybe it's now, but what fourth wave is definitely doing is talking about intersectionality finally. Yeah. So third wave feminism, there's still a lot of turfism going on. And maybe we don't know what turfism going on, TRF. I will update that note to myself after class. So turfism, let's see if I can bring up a better. What is a turf? Okay. Osmo, that's probably a reasonable place. Okay. No, I do not want you to do that. Okay, confirm my choices. Stop tracking me, everybody. Okay, turfism. Trans, exclusionary, radical feminists. And we're going to talk a lot about this in our final category, which is LGBTQ plus. But turfism means that a turf is a feminist who believes that the term woman or the idea of feminism only applies to human beings who have a uterus, right? So this is sort of the same slicing up of the movement that happened when we were in the end of first and in second wave feminism, right? That there's a group of people who are intersectional who are being excluded because some people, the people of privilege, don't want to deal with their messier realities. And those of you who notice detail have probably seen a lot of Harry Potter stuff behind me in our Zooms. I am a huge Harry Potter fan, and it is so disappointing that the author of the Harry Potter world, J.K. Rowling, has done some shameful, disappointing, and very hurtful turfist statements. And by that, I mean, because I'll just use J.K. Rowling as a turf example, because J.K. Rowling is a sexual abuse survivor, and because she has been influenced by misleading information about transgendered people, she is afraid of this myth that a transgender woman might actually be just a costume or a ruse for a man to get into private spaces for women. So, I mean, it's like generally offensive to even say this myth, but as we were talking about stereotypes that societies of privilege have put onto African diasporic peoples, right? We were looking at all those horrible cartoons a few weeks ago. So same thing is true of trans people, that there's a mythology that a man might dress as a woman in order to get into a woman's bathroom and hide there to attack women sexually. That is not a trans woman. That is a male sexual offender, right? But a TERF doesn't believe that. A TERF doesn't believe that a trans person is a woman. And we're going to talk so much more about this next week. So let me try not to get too lost. I don't believe that, just to be clear. Fourth wave feminism, so we're talking about the 2000s for sure, is trying to adjust and make up for the way that feminism has left intersectional groups behind before. So to acknowledge for sterilization, for example, to acknowledge that trans women are also women. They also suffer from many of the same oppressive institutional and social pains that women are oppressed by. For example, the way that a man is significantly less likely to feel scared for his personal safety when walking alone on a street at night. Whereas if you're a woman, on some level, you are probably on some level scared to be assaulted when walking by yourself at night every single day of your gosh darn life, right? And that is absolutely true for trans women and for women anywhere in the spectrum. Like, that's just a thing, especially for Black women, especially for Black trans women, right? So reshaping the idea of like, what is feminism fighting for, to be inclusive instead of exclusive. And as we talked about in the other waves, that division also often happens when trying to get power to achieve certain things separates, right? Because when you separate groups, then one group gets power and the other group gets behind, and that is always a complicated issue. Okay, so does that kind of, oh, and the other marker for fourth wave feminism is the internet. So that also puts us like late 90s, especially like social media being used for activism is part of the marker that was the turning point for fourth wave feminism. Yeah. Okay. All right. We have way too much to get through in 10 minutes. So I'm going to share I'm going to save some of this for next week, but let me kind of give you an info. We're getting back to dance now. Yay, dance. We are going to talk about, now that we've talked about like what are the social rules and legal obstructions and social movements for women from the 1800s up to today, right? We have those 4 chunks of time of feminism. We talked a little bit about the legal rights of women way back. So the next section is really to talk about like, how does movement and costume, but how is the movement that we think of now as sexy, like where did that come from? Because society's idea of what is seductive, what is attractive, what is desirable, those aren't just out of the blue, right? We know, hopefully, that if you look at different cultures around the world, the idea of what is beautiful on a woman's body and on a man's body, on a trans person's body, the idea of what is beautiful is different in different countries. It's different in different times, different time eras, right? Sometimes it's fashionable to be androgynous. Sometimes it's fashionable to be skinny. Sometimes it's fashionable to be like really curvy and round. Sometimes, like in the 1990s, it was fashionable to look like you were about to die from a heroin overdose. Weird. Beauty standards make no sense. Actually, they make a lot of sense. So how did we come up with those things? So we're going to look more next week at what makes the idea we have now of sexy happen. Yes, so Marilyn Monroe is a great example. Marilyn Monroe, we think about Marilyn Monroe, I think now in the 2000s as having been this more curvy woman, because she was definitely big busted. And you see on the internet, or at least I used to a while ago, you used to see like, oh, she was a size 12, whereas in the 1990s and 200s, like an average fit woman's size is considered, they used to say 8. It was never true. You were always looking at models who are 4s, if not double zeros in the 90s. A size 12 in Marilyn Monroe's time was actually a size 8. Sorry for the disappointing news. And as Marilyn Monroe dealt with her substance abuse issues and age and all of those things, she fluctuates. So a lot of the images that we see of Marilyn Monroe, there are a few of her being more curvy, but she's not actually that curvy. And then sometimes she's much bigger, but she was such a stunning sex symbol that it did change for that time what was considered sexy. So why do we think that shape is sexy? Well, curviness, right, was made sexy by the corset. And people were wearing like corseting devices without bones in the 1700s. So I love this discussion. I'm going to try not to stick on it too much, because there were no bras until, when did the bra get invented? Like Jazz Age, basically. Bras were out in the Jazz Age, and then they finally invented them after that, because before the Jazz Age, there was a great big movement of part of the first wave feminism for women to become physically fit, because if you were just stuck in your tiny household all the time, you probably weren't as strong being stuck in a corset all the time as you might be if you had a life outside on a farm and you were working and moving your body or dancing or any of those other things. So part of first wave feminism's movement was also to stop it being so fashionable to tight lace your corset, because if you could stay home and wear a really fashionable corset and be restricted and not move and be prim and proper, right? That told the story that you were a person of privilege. And so that became the beauty ideal at the end of the 1800s, and also during Victorian era. But this idea that what most people think of as a corset, this tight waist thing, is mostly towards the end of the 1800s. And it was feminism that said, throw out your corsets, go ride a bike. Yeah. So old school clubbing is what I call this picture. And it's talking about the women in France who did get to go out dancing, which is where we have the beginning of can-can dancing, which is originally a 4-person dance called the quadrille, where the men did all the high kicks and jumps, but the women started to do it not long after. Let's see, 12:25. So I'm going to just scan here and then we'll come back to this deep dive. Remember, we watched a little bit of the tango jazz dance scene from Moulin Rouge. So we're going to talk about La Danse Apache. It's a racist title. It's in French, but it was a huge trend. Remember, we talked about Salome last week and how all those women were dressing up in their homes as the Art Nouveau version of Salome, doing a appropriated version of belly dance for the other women in their homes. The next big dance trope that Miss Denguette, we'll talk about her, and also well, there were many women who did this dance, but it's that idea of a dance that's choreographed that looks like a domestic violence fight. Why was that a trend? Why was it supposedly sexually empowering? We're going to talk about that next week. And then we'll look at some old school burlesque. I need a picture in here. Yeah, so we're going to talk about burlesque that happens in these sorts of costuming. We're going to talk about how the can-can led to Folly's show and the Moulin Rouge, and also Busby Berkeley. And we started today with this All That Jazz Bossy Dance tribute that was actually done by the Radio City Rockettes. So those are all dances that we're going to look at, like from burlesque, working girls, nightclubbing in the 1890s, and how did those things morph, combined with swing dancing and Orientalist versions of belly dancing and tap to become jazz dance on Broadway with those big Follies Girl show, to become competitive jazz dancing, to become Chicago, which is a Fosse musical, and the idea of what we think of as like athletic female dance sexuality on the big stage, so concert dance and Broadway. And then we'll talk about the following week how that version of sexuality, how that like version of moving is apparent back into hip hop, jazz funk, Beyonce, and Josephine Baker, the world's first superstar. Yeah. So that's what we will do next week. So I'm glad that we started out with a lot of dance videos today, because today was like a heavy history day. There's lots of resources in the dance class, and we can connect all these dots for the next 2 weeks. We're going to stay on this topic. So any questions before we sign off today?